Thanks everyone for tuning in, at least very late where I am. I'm sure it's all other times of day where everyone else is. So you look, I'll give a very brief update in terms of our council services by council workers campaign as it corresponds with last year's local government elections. And then I might frame that in the context of our recent national election, which concluded 4 or 5 weeks ago, with a view to also tapping into our state election, which should be early next year. I think key for everyone on the call to understand our particular political context is that local government in New South Wales in particular reacts and interacts with all 3 tiers of government in the Australian system. Obviously, the local elected members drive operational decision making, whether services are in-house or outsourced. The state government builds the regulatory framework within which these local councils operate, and then in Australia, the federal government collects and distributes most of the tax revenue. So in a roundabout way is the primary funder of local council services. So there is quite a complicated interrelated nature between the 3 tiers of government. But turning first to the local elected level, and as Daria mentioned, there was an election in December of last year. It was a long awaited and long delayed election due to various restrictions associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we had elected councillors who were running 5 and 6 year terms, where they ordinarily would run 4-year terms due to delays associated with the pandemic. And we also had a much more widespread deployment of postal and electronic voting. I raised those points for this reason. We saw a very unpredictable set of results to the extent that there is widespread polling for local elections in New South Wales. The polls were dramatically off, and we primarily put that down to the unusual nature of conducting largely remote ballots in response to various COVID health restrictions. As Daria mentioned, we did deploy as the sort of primary limb of our campaign a pledge, which we asked candidates to commit to a number of things, primarily to prioritise the use of in-house labour and to reject the notion of outsourcing and privatising council or municipal functions. All told, we had about 470 candidates across 126 local councils who signed on to that pledge. Obviously, not all of those candidates were successful. If they were, we would be in a much better spot, but we had a fairly good success rate, just under 50%. I think the last count was 48% of successfully elected candidates were candidates that signed our pledge. And if we drill into that detail a little bit further, we targeted between 9 and 12 specific municipal areas for what I'm going to call a bit more robust or direct campaigning efforts. And in those areas, we saw 55 to 60% of candidates who signed pledges successfully elected. So a couple of things that we've drawn from those numbers. We obviously have allies, and a significant number of allies across all the local government areas in New South Wales where these elections were held. Obviously, a number under 50% may or may not represent a majority of the elected body, depending on the variance from council area to council area. And built into that number, we have to recognise that there would have been and were a number of candidates who signed that pledge but were not committed to the various elements of the pledge. So we can't confidently say that we have a majority of all elected councillors in a majority of all councils, but it would be fair to say that we have a significant number of allies that will help us drive positive decision making with respect to remunicipalisation and contracting of council work. In some respects, the pledge is a long-term play over the term of this elected council term, which is going to be 4 years, to try and address contracting issues as they arise. But we have managed to secure some early wins in that front. We've had one council area, the Albury council area, which is a border community between New South Wales and Victoria, the southern tip of New South Wales, where we had a number of senior elected officials who signed the pledge, and were looking to actively outsource their cultural, museum and community services function in the scheme of labour and member considerations. It was a fairly small function area, probably only 15 or 20 staff, but we were actually able to secure that service, despite an initial vote of the elected body to outsource, remained in-house. We were able to utilise the councillors and elected members who signed the pledge and essentially leverage their support to retain that service in-house. So it is a relatively small win. It is a relatively early win in terms of the campaign, but it does give us some level of confidence that moving forward, the structure and the networks and the allies that we've recruited and developed throughout this campaign will ultimately bear fruit. We do not anticipate winning every one of these battles, but winning the first one off the rank is obviously encouraging, and it's better to be 1 from 1 than 0 from 1. So it is early days in what is a long-term, sustained and central battle for us over the next 4 years of this council term. I anticipate it'll probably extend much beyond that, but we're working in electoral cycles for the local government sense here. So we are cautiously optimistic that the structures that we've put in place will work. We have deployed similar tactics in previous electoral terms, and I'm sure the idea of getting elected members to sign pledges is not something that is a unique strategy for unions across the world. I suppose in terms of our learnings, one of the things that we have historically not done well is maintain connections with those people who sign pledges moving forward. Our template has historically been to interact with these people in the immediate run-up to elections and then shortly thereafter, and then only tap or exercise those relationships when issues arise. We are taking a really active role and making a conscious effort to ensure we maintain these relationships throughout the full length of the term. We are continuing to develop those relationships. We are organising series of roundtable symposiums and catch-ups with those allies on elected councils, just to ensure that, number one, they're reminded of the commitments they made to us and our members, but number two, to also encourage them and educate them on the issues that we think are relevant in terms of privatisation. So one of the primary things that we are seeing happen, and this ties into the funding model I mentioned earlier, where the federal government is sort of in an indirect way one of the primary funders of local government in New South Wales, is we have seen over the past 20 to 25 years a dramatic shrinking in the funding of local government. In the early 1990s, we were funding approximately 2% of Australia's gross domestic product was going to local government through federal grants. We are now at something like 0.58% of gross domestic product. So we've seen a dramatic reduction in one of the main revenue streams. That has had the effect of causing councils to seek short-term, immediate operational cost reductions through outsourcing. Lots of private operators in New South Wales will offer loss-leading contracts for 5 or 10-year terms. The communities will sell off the assets that perform the function, whether it's in waste, community services, or other essential areas, to sign up to these what seem to be quite generous financial terms. But when the renewal hits and they have no assets to deliver the service, the private operators will return to market prices, which are significantly worse for communities. So the financial pressure that's sort of been driven down into the system is driving, in our estimation, councils to this contract model. So what we're trying to be very conscious of as we develop our allies in the local government elected networks is to educate them on that particular economic trap that we find many councils are falling into, so that they can be more forward-looking and long-term in their thinking and planning. We think getting a fairly good response to that kind of economic narrative amongst allies, as they are starting to see probably the back end of a serious period of neoliberal sort of deregulation Australian politics in the late 90s and early 2000s, we're starting to see a lot of those contracts bite in terms of financial sense as they come to the end of their 10 or 15-year term. So it is probably the case of an economic narrative meeting an appropriate economic moment where that's starting to hit home to lots of people, and we're starting to find a more willing audience. I might just finally touch on Daria, unless there are any other matters or questions I'm happy to take, just in terms of the sort of third limb of our structure. So I've touched on the local council piece as well as the federal government funding model. But in New South Wales, lots of the structures of local council is driven by the state government, so that middle tier of elected representation. They design the structures within which local councils can operate. We are anticipating a state government election in May of next year, and we are actively trying to lobby the centre-left party, the Labor Party, who have historically been aligned with the trade union movement in Australia, to make a number of policy changes in the lead up to this election to ensure that if they are successful, they are currently in opposition, but if they are successful in taking government, that we can drive some positive changes with respect to contracting. Again, these ideas won't be particularly revolutionary to the people on the call, but we are seeking a legislative mandate for a, quote, site rates policy. So essentially an economic disincentive for councils in deploying contract labour. If councils are going to outsource a service, we are seeking a legislative fetter, a legislative bar, to ensure that they have to employ staff on the same terms and conditions as they would if they were employing them staff directly. Again, we don't want people to actually contract that service, but we hope that it'll operate as an economic disincentive. We are also seeking a parliamentary inquiry and a positive obligation upon councils to review all the services they currently have outsourced, with a view to establishing a business case as to whether those services should and could be brought in-house. I think as I mentioned the last time I addressed this group, we've had a period of market deregulation in Australia over a long term, seriously beginning in the mid-90s. So we're now well and truly 30 years into that neoliberal project. So we've seen lots of services already go out. So as much as we want to defend the turf that we currently have, a big part of our growth strategy must be to bring services back in-house. And part of that has to be building an economic narrative that these services are more viable for communities in-house. We think that there are clear economic indicators which say that that's the case, but we need legislative amendment at the state government level to ensure that local councils are under a positive obligation to undertake that assessment to ensure that they can then build the economic argument for their communities in bringing the service in-house. So as well as trying to drive those elected councils on an operational level to make those decisions, we are starting to actively advocate the centre-left opposition party to make those elements part of their platform going into an election next year, with the view that they hopefully will be successful and that those things can drive policy in New South Wales moving forward. Excuse me. Daria, that's all I really had planned to say. I'm happy to take questions or deal with any other particular matters you think I haven't addressed or would be of particular interest to the group.